Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. I will be reading to you today from the novel Micronation. This is Chapter 15, Planning and Execution. I went back to my little hotel room and waited for the cops to arrive. Once the Salamander family found my bugs, the truth was that it was just an excuse. I wasn't sure what to do. It also gave me a chance to look at the data I'd stolen from Colonel Salamander. The first thing I confirmed was that his general contempt for what he called the Cult of Innocence. Apparently, the cult members were a smaller third conspiracy to sway the other two towards the protection of children. Indeed, the more I looked, the more I confirmed what I'd been told. The great master conspiracies were generally more alliances of conspiracies rather than some unified whole. Some of them were entirely independent. I did have names and dates now, but they didn't mean much. I was done with house crawling, and I was not a murderer. Granted, I'd come close a few times with Prowl, but that was as far as it was going to get. Giving what I had heard to the media was even worse, since, quote, they, end quote, really did control them. Logs weren't even quite as safe as I thought, since Mrs. Salamander's contacts and directions to her troops indicated that she had hundreds of followers. So, what to do? I tried making a few lists. Every idea I thought of involved trusting someone else, but there was no one else I could trust. This was about the time I considered checking myself into an asylum, only Prow was sure to visit me there, and this time I'd be in a straitjacket so I couldn't hit him. If only I'd never met Prow. If only I'd never gone to work for him. If only I hadn't fallen in love with Darla. If only I hadn't ever heard about memes. That was it. I had it. I needed Amberlove's help. She was the only person who had the sense to remove herself from this and, therefore, the one person I could trust. Then I realized, if I brought her back in, did that not make me no better than Quiescent's Prowl? And yet, by not telling Amberlove anything, was I not deciding for her? Prowl used annoyance, violence, and emotional manipulation to get his way. I would show up to Amberlove, present the facts as I saw it, and get her advice. If she still saw fit to help me do something, then that would be her decision, not my own. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one I had. I was not very confident in my car, but I deemed that the bus and train might be a bad idea at this point, so I began to drive towards New York City. I had obtained her new last name and address from Colonel Salamander's database. He had rather large files on Prowl, Darla, and me. Apparently, Amberlove had kept herself busy and now had a very young daughter. She had been married about 2 years. The birth date of the child's certificate put her at 3. Interesting, but I knew it wasn't mine. The drive across the Great Plains was slow and boring. The car broke down 5 times, and 4 of those times I got help from very friendly locals. Thus, the Great Plains were a vast wasteland filled with honest, honorable gents, or something like it. I got to New York City. I arrived at Amberlove's door. I rang the doorbell. I realized that I had absolutely no idea what I was going to say. "Hi, it's me, Chester. I was in prison, but I got better. Only now I'm in the middle of several global conspiracies, and I could use some advice." Somehow that didn't seem like a good idea. A small child opened the door and looked at me. I looked back. Then Amberlove came to the door. She looked well, and had a small infant in her arms that she was rocking back and forth. "Chester!" She smiled, obviously surprised. "What are you doing here?" I need some advice." That was the best I could say. "Well, of course, but why didn't you just call?" She seemed genuinely puzzled. "I'm trying to keep a low profile." She still looked puzzled, but then comprehension dawned on her face. "Ah, of course. It's Mr. Prow, isn't it? He's called a few times asking me if I'd seen you. You two don't get along so well anymore." "You could say that. Prow is only one of the reasons I'm staying as far off the radar as possible. That's one of the things I need your advice about." She looked bemused but shrugged. "Of course. Come in." I entered her apartment. There were 2 gray-something setters that looked up at me from either side of yet another small child, a girl who was watching cartoons on television. The whole room was minor chaos. with toys and children's books strewn all over the place. For the moment, I felt a pang of guilt about potentially placing her children in danger. But then I remembered that in one way or another, they were possibly in danger, whether she knew what was going on or not. We sat down on the rather thick but worn leather couches. She crossed her legs, smiled, folded her arms, and looked professionally attentive. "So what's up, Chester?" I said, "I'm not even sure where to start." "How about at the beginning?" she said. "Where? There are lots of... How about with your arrest and imprisonment? There are a few things from Darla... I've heard a few things from Darla and Mr. Prow, but nothing direct. I want to know what has been happening to you," she smiled. And so I told her. I spoke of my experiences in prison. I told her about my time at Fleur. I told her about my escapades after I left Prow in the dust. At first, she seemed amused by my various antics, but as I spoke of entering the home of Colonel Salamander, her face grew darker. Still, ever the good listener, she let me finish. She absorbed it for some time, not saying anything. I had a lot of questions I wanted to ask, but I did not ask them. I had laid all my cards on the table for a fresh perspective and sound judgment. Aside from her respect for Quiescence Prow, I had never seen or heard her do anything that I did not consider wise. The children had been remarkably patient up until this point, largely engrossed in the cartoon they were currently watching. The silent piece ended when the show ended. The oldest promptly demanded that the TV be changed from one channel to another, breaking the deep spell Amberlove had placed over herself. She changed the channel and then said, "I don't know really what to say, Chester. I mean, some things are obvious. Darla is doing some things that do sound disturbing. It sounds like you're right about wanting to avoid Mr. Prow. It sounds like Colonel Salamander is a bad person and you don't want to help him. But I know lots of people in government, and even if this conspiracy nonsense is true, almost all the real government has nothing to do with it. And Chester, you burned down his pool house so you could sneak inside? What were you thinking?" "Well, I had to find out why." Because I'm tired of being a pawn, that's why." "So you burned down his pool house? How is that logical?" I said, "I had to get information. To do that, I had to get into the house. Do you have any other idea how I could have done that?" She thought for several moments and said, "Nothing comes to mind. But that still doesn't make it an acceptable answer. Was it really worth it?" "I think so, but I admit I'm not sure." "Well, that's something at least." She seemed a little relieved that I wasn't entirely crazy. "So what do you think I should do?" I asked. "Well, I think you should try to stop Fleur." "Why them?" "For a few reasons. The communists, the fascists, and the Cult of Innocence seem to be way too nebulous and big for you to do anything about. None of them are really good people, but even if you had all the secrets of the other conspiracies, you couldn't really have anything they want, so they wouldn't really have any leverage with them." "Prow," I said, interrupting her in a flash of insight. "Right. Mr. Prow's obsessed with you, and they obviously need him for some reason, which gives you an in. In a perfect world, you could somehow use Fleur to slow down or interfere with the other three." I nodded. It made sense. "Do I contact Salamander and use him as an ally against Fleur?" "I don't know, Chester. How good a liar are you?" "Not a very good one." "Then what are you going to say if the subject of this pool house comes up?" "Good point. Right. Avoid Colonel Salamander. Any other advice?" "Check yourself into a psychiatric ward? You need help, Chester. Your behavior isn't rational." "Prow would just get himself locked up with me in there," she sighed. "Point." I stood. "Thank you for your help, Amberlove. I appreciate it." She looked incredulous. "Where are you going?" Away." "Sit down." I felt strangely compelled to sit down. I was used to the effect, and this answered any question as to whether or not she had gone through the operation. Whatever strange immunity I'd built up against memetics clearly didn't work with her. I sat down. She said, "You were going to do this without my help, weren't you?" Well, yes, you have. I have children. Yes, I do. Some of them are even mine. This isn't about going to a nice restaurant. This is likely to be deadly. Sure it is. But then again, sitting here and doing nothing doesn't bode well for our futures either. Take your pick. Sit there and let it happen, or get up and do something about it." "Well, I agree, but..." "And I intend to do something about it. Sorry about interrupting you so much, by the way. It's a terrible, rude, and vulgar habit, and you should never..." "What about your husband?" I asked. She glared at me. I couldn't tell if it was for interrupting her or asking about her husband. "He left." "He left?" "Yes." "What happened?" She frowned. "I don't want to talk about it." "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Okay, well, who's going to take care of your children?" "I can call my sister." "Just like that?" She smiled. "Just like that. So," I paused awkwardly. "So, I guess we're going to Fleur together." "I guess so," she smiled, smirking. "Do you have a computer? I'll buy the tickets. It was the least I could do. Of course, I suspected they'd track it, but speed was of the essence. If they hadn't started yet, it was the fastest way. It was a risk, no matter what. I can pay for my own ticket. I'd rather you didn't. Have it your way, she said, and she shrugged and left the room, presumably to call her sister. I had to look around a bit to find a computer. Eventually I did. Booking tickets to Hlur was surprisingly easy. Apparently, Hlur took direct commercial flights now. That just seemed so weird to me, but not as weird as these kids of Amberlove's. I don't know if it was memes, good parenting, or a genetic addiction to television, but these children did not get up or do anything else the entire time I was there, not once. I got a place at a nearby hotel and made plans to leave with Amberlove in the morning. The hotel was awful, but it was cheap. I considered emailing Prow ahead of time, but decided against it. Why spoil the surprise? That and the fact that I really couldn't be sure what random and highly disturbing thing that Prow would do next. Why take chances? Amberlove and I took a taxi to the airport. We didn't talk much along the way. Something was bothering her. What's wrong? I asked. Do you remember that thing I didn't want to talk about? Your husband? Right, she said, and I still don't want to talk about it. We got to the airport, but much to my surprise, Amberlove directed the taxi to an entirely separate airline. What's going on? I asked. There's been a change of plans, she said, moving us into another line. I changed them. Amberlove looked out the window. Why? This made no sense. I was willing to cut Amberlove some slack, but this was definitely unusual. I had a change of heart. We're going to Colorado Springs, she said, had a slightly crazed look in her eyes. This was very un-Amberlove-like expression, and it worried me. Okay, are you going to tell me what those plans are? No. Crazy people. I was surrounded by crazy people. And why should I go with you then? She sighed, exasperated as we moved forward in line. Because you wanted my help. Because we're in public, so people might overhear us. And because I wanted to maintain something of the element of surprise. I thought about that for a moment. It kind of made sense. All right, I'll go along with it for now. She smiled, knowingly, and moved towards the ticket counter. She bought 2 tickets for Colorado Springs. We talked a lot on the plane. She wouldn't talk about all the details of where we were going, what we were going to do once we got there, but she listened to the details of my imprisonment with rapt fascination. There were no questions too obscure to ask. Some of them were downright uncomfortable. Most I answered. Some I did not. When we arrived at the Denver airport, we rented a car. It was a very comfortable luxury sedan. I had to admit, this would fit into Colonel Salamander's neighborhood much better than the last car I'd bought. We drove down to Colorado Springs. Finally, we pulled into the parking lot of a diner. Amberlove said she was hungry. I asked her what she was going to tell me when she was going to tell me what she was planning, but she just shrugged and smiled. The diner was a typical place. It served greasy food to equally greasy customers. I ordered a greasy grilled cheese sandwich and a greasy French fries. After dinner, we drove around Colorado Springs for 20 minutes, with Amberlove asking me to turn down random streets before I finally went nuts. What the hell are we doing? Waiting, she said. Waiting for what? That. What? That, she smiled and didn't say any more. What are you talking about? I know what we need to do now. I did my best not to hit her. My parents raised me better. Fortunately, I succeeded, but barely. Fine, but you drive. We got out and switched places. I directed Amberlove to Colonel Salamander's house. She slowed down to look at it for a moment, and then we drove by. She then pulled over by the side of the road. She used her cell phone to look up an industrial supply shop. We bought a blowtorch, a small metal press, and some sheets of metal. Once we got to the hotel room, Amberlove put the blowtorch away and waited. Then, at night, we drove to the middle of nowhere and she began to build a small metal box. I did not understand it at all until she took out a can of gray spray paint and applied a thick coating to the metal box. You're building a utility box? I said. She looked up, raised her visor in front of her eyes and smiled. Good guess, Chester. And what am I going to do with it? It took me about 2 minutes. I finally said, you're going to hide it near Colonel Salamander's house? She nodded and kept waiting. At about 3:30 in the morning, we loaded it back into the car and drove to Colonel Salamander's house. She dropped it by the car and put some kind of electronic device inside the car and then moved, with stealth and speed I did not know she possessed, to put the box next to Colonel Salamander's house. Then she raced back to the car. What was that? I said. She motioned me to silence and then drove away. Once we had gotten a sufficient distance, she said, "That recorder will take the bugs you planted and listen. I'm honestly surprised they never got found, despite your paranoia. It's got enough battery power for 2 days. That should give me enough information. Enough information to do what? Why, enough information to destroy the Cult of Innocence, of course." When you say destroy, that didn't sound good. I mean destroy. Yes, but destroy as in get rid of the organization, or just destroy as in or destroy? Destroy. I was tempted to ask her another question, but I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know the answer. As the next 2 days came and went, I kept trying to decide if I should. We talked about her kids. She called them her kids even though they were from a previous marriage of her husband. She didn't say a thing about the cult, though, and I didn't ask. I noticed that she never called her sister to ask about the kids. She must have put a lot of faith in her sister. Early in the morning of the third day, we set out to get the box. While we were driving past the gas station outside the subdivision, she asked, "Did you know that almost all of the core leadership of the Cult of Innocence are descended from 3 little girls of the Salem witch trials?" I did not. She ignored me and kept on. I mean, don't get me wrong. People who take advantage of children in that way are the lowest form of human life. But what about people who take advantage of the natural desire to defend their children? They're the same people we need to protect our children from. Worse even. You're telling me that a politician is the same as a pedophile? The ones that were exploiting children for their own gain are? Yes. Look, they know exactly what they're doing. People care about their children. Even some people without children look back at their childhoods with nostalgia. Innocence is the unwritten value in this society. People have exploited concepts like patriotism or altruism throughout human history alike. Look at it this way. We both agree that the Cult of Innocence is bad, right? Yeah, sure, definitely. But you're not going to put them on the same level as the people they exploit. I don't exactly. Bad choice of words. You don't think that someone who gains power by stirring up public anger is the same as someone who attacks children? Yes. Honestly, I don't, I said. Really? How closely did you read the information that you took out of Colonel Salamander's computer? She asked. Quite a bit. Not that much, apparently. But that's neither here nor there. The fact of the matter is that they're gaining power by latching onto society's most sacred tenet. Some of them do this for the right reasons, but Colonel Salamander and his crowd actually direct attention from stopping real problems and devote society's energy to tangible areas that coincidentally allow them to control the lives of others. Can't you see how those who use such tactics for personal gain to enslave others are just as problematic as those who perform such vile acts? That's beside the point. They may be doing something wrong. May? She asked. Okay, are doing something wrong, but that doesn't mean you still don't see it? She sounded disgusted. Honestly, no. I agree that they need to be stopped. I'm sorry. You're never going to convince me that political parasites are on the same level of evil as people who use children that way? What about the people who don't use them? She said, holding her fingers to her forehead as if she had a headache. Who traffic pictures but never actually do anything themselves? I thought about it. I guess they're just as guilty. Why? Because they're facilitators. Well, people who reach the same self-righteous orgasmic fury have needs fulfilled by pushers of a different sort. There's a difference between people who legitimately want to protect children and people who wield their self-righteousness as like a club, making people afraid to stand up to them. People like Mrs. Salamander, people like Colonel Salamander, and I don't intend to let them get away with it anymore. I shook my head. I don't believe that. I'm not defending the cult. I'm simply saying that you do believe I'm right, she said, like it was a real command, and she was quite angry. No, I don't. She looked shocked. What did you say? I said I just don't believe that. But that's impossible, she cried and broke down sobbing. She pulled up her knees to her children. Why, it's so inconceivable for me to have my own ideas. I said, only as soon as I said it, I knew I wasn't talking to just any normal, ordinary, run-of-the-mill person. I was talking to someone who had the ability to alter opinions of others at will, and the meme hadn't affected me. Why? That wasn't very thoughtful. She smiled and shook her head. No, it wasn't. Why are you smiling? I think our alliance is at an end, Amberlove. No. I'm not smiling because of what I did to you. I'm smiling because of what I didn't do. She spoke as quickly as she could get the words out of her mouth. Huh? I asked. She sat up. Do you know what it's like to never be able to tell anyone to do anything? I have to even watch letting others think that they know what I want, otherwise they'll do it. For some reason, that doesn't seem to affect you. Huh, interesting indeed. I had to look into that later. For now, we had other things to worry about. The sun was rising in the east. I had a few I saw a few people go out of their cars. It was only now that I realized that we were driving in circles. I felt lucky that we hadn't crashed or run out of gas. Stop the car. Stop the car. I stopped the car. It probably wasn't some kind of command. It was just common sense. When people tell me stop the car, I'm assuming they're going to vomit or something. That kind of activity is best done outside the car. What I was not expecting was for Amberlove to rush out of the car and out into Colonel Salamander's front yard and grab the recording device. She raced back to the car. I stared at her in shock. I can't believe you just did that. Go, she whispered fiercely. Fine. I started the car up and drove away. This would not end well. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, she spoke. I suppose I should apologize, but really, Chester, sometimes you can be so paranoid. No, I can't. Yes, you can. Nobody saw anything. The man commands jet fighters, so, with nukes. I was not happy. She laughed. So, Colonel Salamander's going to nuke us now? I sighed. Some people simply didn't have a proper sense of survival. She laughed. She would. We drove back to the hotel. Nothing happened immediately, but I remained vigilant. Sooner or later, Colonel Salamander, Mrs. Salamander, or the little Salamanders were going to find those bugs, and when they did, they would ask old Mrs. Nosy across the street if she'd seen anything unusual. Unusual, like some crazy woman stealing their utility box at 5 a.m. Amberlove patiently listened to the recordings. I tried to help her, but it was too much. I lasted about 2 hours before I had to get out of there. I went down to the hotel bar to have a beer. The bartender gave me a bit of an odd look. It was only 10 a.m. I gave him an odd look back. Why was the bartender working at 10 a.m.? Neither of us said anything. I sat brooding. I had become quite good at that. After half an hour or so, I began to check on Amberlove. She was still at it, so I slept. She woke me in the middle of a very, very interesting dream and said, I have it. I know what I'm going to do to them. Didn't you know that before? Shut up. Look, the meeting you listened to was prepared to prepare for their big leadership conference. When they come into town, I'm going to memes at them. Isn't that unethical? And while I don't like them, how does this solve the problem of getting my life back? She said, I've thought of that. The only way to be safe for sure is if Mr. Prow and Fleur don't want you anymore. I can solve that problem for you. And what about Colonel Salamander? We're solving that problem now. I'm rather unenthusiastic about how vague that is. What precisely are you planning on doing at the leadership conference? I'm going to send them an email convincing people that all of the other people in that group are secret child abusers. That's it? I asked. Well, yes. That should be more than enough. She sounded surprised that I didn't think it was. How's that supposed to work? Once they all suspect each other, they'll start to destroy each other's lives. Just like that. Yes, it's simple but effective. Why do you even think they'll believe you? Because I'm me. I sighed. All right. Let's start with the obvious. This is in writing, right? How do you know your meme theory works when you write it down? She looked away. It does. I wasn't buying that. How do you know? Trust me, it does. Don't ask me more. Right. This just got better all the time. Even if it works, so what? They look, and in not all cases, there's nothing there, Chester. These are fanatics who firmly believe that they were betrayed by one of their own. What do you think they will do if they don't find any proof? And there she had it. Even if she didn't plant evidence, the cult would dig and dig and dig until they destroyed each other. I didn't trust it. It seemed too simple. They didn't even touch on the morality of the issue. The next 2 days passed with the two of us locating the email addresses of the main participants in the leadership conference. Still, apparently Amberlove didn't plan to leave it at that, since I saw her looking up the plans to the convention center in Denver multiple times. I tried to convince her to use a meme to make them simply change their minds and actually do good, to which she replied, given what I've seen, something had to be reinforced a lot of times over time to initiate a change. As near as I can tell, half of those people have no ability to change. The other half are so convinced of their pure morality of their position they won't listen to that either. Amberlove insisted to me numerous times as we drove up to Denver that the efforts at tracking down and prosecuting child abusers would still go on, but perhaps it was just me, but her words sounded hollow. There had to be a way to neutralize those who were evil and leave those who really worked for good in place to act. We know now, more or less, which is which, Amberlove conceded, but the problem is that the good and the real ones look up to the fakes. For this to work, they have to accuse each other. Why don't we just release the information we have? Because they won't believe us. They only believe what their leaders will tell them to believe. Use a meme. You're using that in your plan anyway. What's the difference here? Amberlove thought about it and smiled to me. You know what? You're right. So we found a computer terminal and uploaded all the material that we had to a web server. Then we sent an anonymous email to everyone on the leadership and membership list that Amberlove had gathered. Then we waited. At first, nothing happened. After about an hour, we noticed that more people in the computer lab seemed to be frowning. After 3 hours, we heard vicious shouting matches in the halls of the convention center. I will never know why, but something told me to get out of there as quickly as possible. Fortunately, for once, Amberlove listened to me and we left. As soon as we did, though, I said, "We need to send a counter meme. Those people are reacting very badly." Amberlove disagreed. All we did was nudge them to believe what it was actually true. They're the ones choosing how they react to it. Well, then we need to nudge them into acting a little bit more calmly and rationally. She put her hands on her hips. Aren't you the one who said that kind of thing was wrong? What if the government decided that it was in everyone's best interest to obey the law and pay their taxes? Normally, I'd agree with you. But we've already used a meme. That changed things. We have a responsibility. She yelled this time. I don't have to do anything. I didn't do anything but point them at the truth. They chose how they reacted to it. It was at that point that we heard sirens. It was only one at first, but then another followed. Soon a whole howling symphony of ambulances, fire trucks, and police cars. Obviously, something had happened. Something had. Amberlove, to her credit, wanted to run towards the trouble rather than away from it, but for some reason, call it experience, I didn't think that was a good idea. The government knew about memes, which told me that sooner or later they'd trace it back to Amberlove and me. There had been the tickets we'd bought after all. I said, we need to get out of here. I have to fix... We can't. Look, if you were right, then these people wanted to do this to each other anyway. Quite frankly, I believe it. I mean, really. Now who's being insensitive? Amberlove, this is not a discussion. You're right, it's not. I'm going. She walked towards the car. Have fun. I stayed where I was. Amberlove got in the car and drove off. I should have felt responsible, but to be honest, I wasn't in as much disagreement with Amberlove as I let on. Oh, don't get me wrong. People in the Cult of Innocence are not among the most vile human beings they claim to fight against. But the majority of the cult seemed to be a different kind of monster. I hadn't intended this, but it had happened, nevertheless. I couldn't make Amberlove see reason. She was starting to annoy me anyway. It was time to find a way to deal with Prow once and for all. It was time to return to Hlur.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Welcome to the secret commentary at the end of each chapter. Normally I wait a full minute, but honestly, if you've gotten this far, you probably already know about the secret commentary, and frankly, given what the numbers show, the number of people listening to this at this point is few and far between. When I put together the recording of the novel, which I've been slowly just adding chapter by chapter. I won't be including this commentary. It's my way of excusing the incredibly bad writing, although I realize now that I'm having some alpha readers look at Project NIMBY, there's some problems there too. I'm not saying that the people who told me to stop writing were right. I'm saying that as good as my writing has improved with Army of Fire and The Fate of Inglemia, just reading this, there are problems. So I'm going to make the argument that this, to me, is the worst chapter of the entire novel so far. It's obvious, having read the other chapters recently, that I lost focus in the 2 years that it took me to write chapter 14, and I'm including elements that I never actually described in the first 13 chapters. I kind of hinted at the conspiracies, but I certainly never included concrete details of communism versus fascism. The idea of the Cult of Innocence is this third conspiracy being involved. It sounds nice, but I don't spend any time in the previous chapters building up to it. I have my protagonists running all over the place, doing things, arguing with each other, changing their own opinion in the middle of the chapter. I mean, as bad as this novel was, this chapter actually makes it worse. Frankly, I would be better off doing what I did with Forever West and taking the entire last third of my book, lopping it off with an amputation and ending it with the part that was good, where basically they had the big battle with the freaking boat 3 chapters ago. Amberlove and Chester changed their minds 2 or 3 times within the course of the entire thing. Chester gets along with no one. Amber gets along with no one. This book is composed of 4 assholes who interact with other assholes, stopping other assholes from doing things or helping other assholes do things. I mean, there's no sense of theme. There's no sense of coherence. Chester kind of makes sense, but Amberlove has sure changed a lot in a couple of years, which, to be fair, marriage and children can do that, but she changes her mind multiple times within the course of the chapter. And, I get sometimes that moral ambiguity can happen, but there's nobody for the reader to rally behind. There's nobody for the reader to say, I'm going to take their side. It's just incoherent nonsense. And if you're still listening to this at this point, you must be doing so or from a desire to see the rest of the traffic accident as it happens. The one thing I will say that I like about this chapter is how it astounds me. Cat is doing crap in the back where I need to stop him, but I'm too lazy to stop the recording now that I've started. Given now that Dobbs has overturned Roe v. Wade, the one thing that does strike me about this book is how even 12 years ago when I wrote this book, how the Russians are still awful, how the evangelicals are still awful, how this cult of innocence is a real thing, and how they use justification of, quote, for the children, end quote, to oppress people is still just as real and just as awful as it ever was.